So I was sitting at the Bull and Barrel this week working on the message because O'Hara's is closed. O'Hara's is closed on Tuesday in case anybody's come watching. I feel like I'm cheating, when I'm at the Bull. It's like I'm cheating on my pub girlfriend. I don't know, like it's weird. And the funny thing is, like, because O'Hara's is closed on Tuesday, like the Bull, almost the whole bar was the regulars from O'Hara's. And we're all trying to pretend like we don't notice each other there. Anyway. But I was sitting there watching, and the one thing that the Bull does that O'Hara's doesn't do is they put on that, that news channel? The one that has like all of the stuff, like it's designed for ADD because they got like the little TV screen and they got the scrolling stuff and the news headlines. And it's really weird because often the headlines don't match the picture, which is like really messed up. Thanks, Roy. And I was sitting there and I was watching it and I'm trying to work on the message. And literally all hell is breaking loose. One of the things that we talk about at Vox all the time is that in the scriptures, when Jesus talks about God's kingdom coming, it's this reality that God's kingdom comes here. It's not some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away. But it's that God wants to establish his kingdom here, heaven on earth. But the reality is that right now we have hell on earth sometimes. And right now a little more than usual. It's been hard, you doom scroll on our phones, right? It's a new phrase we have now, doom scrolling, where you just keep flying through all of the horrible headlines, especially because that's the only headlines they publish, right? The more horrible, the better. The news was this week, there was disaster is imminent was the headline. Can you guess what that was about? Anybody? No, baseball strike. Seriously? Disaster is imminent. They're canceling the first 90 games of the season. It's okay, there's 380 games left in the season. After the 90 games, they're canceling. But this is what happens. Like, we make everything even worse than it should be. And so you've got all this stuff going on social media. And then the division in our country, thinking about the division in our country, it's so polarized now. Everything is so extreme. And everybody's so angry about everything all the time. Instead of reserving it for what really matters, like country music. Yeah, going to the grocery store and spending $5 for a head of cauliflower. Whoa, sucks to be a vegetarian. Filling up the car, I wrote in here, filling up the car with gas at $1.60, and it's what now? This was Tuesday, right? $1.84. Overwhelming. It feels so huge. It feels too big. It feels beyond me. It feels like what can I do? I can't do anything. Drink and binge watch TV. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. It feels too big. It feels paralyzing. It feels beyond me. And it's been hard with everything going on because we've had to come to terms with the foundational worldviews of the people around us. I think because everything has been so intensified, the foundations of how people live and think and make decisions have been exposed. They used to be more hidden. You didn't really see them before. And now you see them loud and in your face, these foundational realities of how people choose to see the world, how people interact. That's really kind of what's going on. And it's even these foundational views that you decide what information you're going to trust and what information you're not going to trust. Right? How do you decide what to pay attention to? How do you decide what news channels to give weight to and what ones not to give weight to? It's hard sometimes. And the truth is, I think part of it is that we go about life believing it's a cognitive decision. What I mean by that is we believe that we have decided based on the evidence and we've examined everything and we've made the decision. In fact, this phrase that got really popular during this whole pandemic time was do your own research, right? Do your own research, which is somewhat good. Also a little difficult if you don't happen to have the skills necessary to do your own research. But this idea of do your own research, because we believe we're making decisions based off of our research, off the stuff we've learned, etc. But the truth of the matter is that we don't, for the most part. We make decisions because there's an emotional connection. There's an emotional dissonance, a cognitive dissonance that feels awkward when we're out of line with our foundational worldview. And when we find something that lines up with our worldview, it feels better. And we're like, oh, okay. Oh, okay, I wasn't wrong. Okay, I'm good. And so the truth of the matter is what we're seeing around us is people saying stuff about what they believe about the world, but the truth is it's not actually what's going on. It's how they feel about what they believe about the world. It's this foundational worldview that's kind of coming. What are you going to give your attention to? What are you going to submit to? What do you consider valid? Because the truth is nobody comes to some of the extreme positions that we see on all sorts of issues right now. You don't get to those extremes very often rationally. It's hard to find yourself on the extreme edge of something because all of the rational thought processes led to that place. That can happen from time to time, but not as much as happening in the world today. Life is just way too complicated for it to be boiled down to the simplicity that we see around us in almost every area of life at the moment. How do you decide what matters to you then? We talked about this a few months ago. How do you decide what really matters to you? How do you decide what is your foundation for how you live? How you're going to go about everyday life, because we still have to do everyday life for the last 2 years, right? 2 years ago, we didn't know. That was our last normal week. But for 2 years, we've gone about life, and we've thrived, to be really honest with you. It hasn't been great. But we're here. Congratulations. Yay! You made it. You're here. Ha ha ha. Isn't that exciting? Right? We did. We survived. But we were making decisions all the way along. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them because we thought we had a good reason. Sometimes because we just sort of went with our gut. Because going with your gut is ultimately a belief system. It's a foundational belief system. I don't think it's a particularly great one. There's some argument to be made. Malcolm Gladwell made some interesting arguments in his book Blink, which has since been somewhat disproved. But, there's some interesting stuff there. But I don't think it's the best thing. But it's still a foundational belief system to go with your gut. It's a foundational belief system to do whatever Fox News tells you. I don't think that's a particularly good one either. But, these are foundational belief systems. They're ways that people make these kinds of decisions. So how are you going to decide the most important things in your life? The reason this matters is because where we are right now, it's really hard when life gets really, really stressful, right? It's easy to make decisions when everything is going really well. It's easy to make financial decisions when you're doing well, there's lots of room in the budget, and if you screw up, oh well, not a big deal. It's really hard to make financial decisions when there's no room in the budget and there's no room for error. It's easy to make decisions about social life and how you're going to treat other people, etc., when everybody is relatively forgiving. It's really hard when everyone is angry and screaming at each other all of the time. Anyways, so today's passage. This is what happened in the passage that Heather looked at last week, and we're kind of bookending. We're sort of, we kind of like overlapped a little in our messages. And so this last week, Jesus drops this hard teaching, and people aren't having it, right? That's kind of the whole thing. Jesus drops this hard teaching, and the people are like, too hard for me, right? Can't do it. John 6:6 says this, "At this point, many of Jesus' disciples came out from behind him and never walked around with him again." Now, this is Frederick Bruner's translation in his commentary. At this point, many of Jesus' disciples came out from behind him and never walked around with him again. This might be one of the most depressing 7 words in Scripture. Like, they came out from behind him and they never walked around with him again. It's heartbreaking. They were following Jesus in the flesh. Jesus. Not Jesus 2,000 years later, and we're still trying to follow. Like, Jesus, right there. Where's Jesus? I can see him. He's over there. He's wearing the white robe with the blue sash. You know what I mean? Probably not. Right? But they knew where Jesus was. They were following. They came out from behind him, and they never walked around with him. It's been banging around in my head all week. They came out from behind him, and they never walked around with him again. My goodness, I think this is a problem in the church today. So many have come out from behind Jesus and they're not walking around with him anymore. They're still using his name, but nothing they do looks like him anymore. Bruner says it this way. He says, imagine the loss. Imagine the loss of excitement, of significance, of fellowship, of purpose, of meaning, of life, and the loss of most tragically of all, Jesus. Because the teaching got too hard. They were following and they walked away. Most translations say they turned away. And I like how Bruner puts it because he says it in the original, both in the Greek and in the understanding of the sort of rabbinic system of the time, it's better translated, they came out from behind him. The rabbi would walk around town and you would know his disciples because they would literally be trailing along behind him like his little posse, right? And they came out from behind him and they didn't walk around with him anymore. They come out from behind, they stop following. And the really sad part for me is that Jesus is continuing on with the rest of the disciples and they stop following. Their worldview had been challenged and they couldn't take it. And this is important to understand. The hard teaching, it wasn't just that what he was asking them to do was too hard, right? It's not like, when you go get a personal trainer. Well, I imagine what it would be like. No, we did. For the Tough Mudder, we had this personal trainer named Tate. Was his name, right? Because I had a rhyme. I came up with the phrase, I hate Tate. He was a lovely gentleman, lovely young man. He was wonderful. He was a very good trainer. But he was like the sweetest guy who made you do the most horrible things. And he would just smile at you while telling you to do things until you barf. Like it was just kind of like I think he might have been like a little bit of a sadist. Anyways, and so Tate would tell you to do something. It's not like when Tate would tell me to do something that's like, I can't do that, it's too hard. It wasn't that. It's not like Jesus says, give up bacon, and you're like, I can't, just can't, it's too hard, I'm walking away, right? It's like Jesus, the problem is that their entire worldview, how they saw the world, just got shattered. N.T. Wright says this, he goes, it was more that what he said made a huge hole in their worldview. And when that happens, some people prefer not to think about it anymore. If you go to a meeting where someone demolishes the way you've been brought up to think and offers you instead a way of looking at the world which, though convincing, will be extremely costly, you may well find good reasons to be somewhere else the next time that preacher comes to town. We do that all the time, right? When your worldview, when those foundational principles, values you live your life by, when those things get shaken, it's terrifying. It's heartbreaking. I remember sitting with my grandfather a little bit before he died, my mom's dad. And he was a brilliant man, literally a genius, had majority of the Bible memorized, and was following Jesus. For him, there was a big part of it that was about getting everything right. It was about making sure you had everything, all of the T's crossed, all of the I's crossed, and the T's dotted, like that kind of thing. It was that sort of idea, and he was a fairly strict man when it came to religion. And I remember sitting with him, and he used to always sit on the floor. It was weird. He'd sit on the floor by the couch. And I remember sitting with him, and he was leaning up against the couch, and he looked sad. And I said, Gramps, what's wrong? And he said, it was love. It was always love, and I got that wrong. And I remember having this, I didn't even understand the significance of how deep that was, particularly for a man who understood the scriptures like he did. That it was love. It was always love. That love should have been at the bottom of the whole thing, at the foundation. Everything should have been built on love, not built on getting it right. You know what I mean? And that aside, what struck me was that I was watching somebody near the end of their life wrestling with the fact that there was a significant hole in their worldview, and I was seeing the pain. Some of you are a part of Vox because of that. You're a part of Vox because there was something about faith that you couldn't shake, but there was also something about religion that seemed sick and broken. And for some of us, there was a really painful period where this thing we had dedicated so much of our lives to, for those of us that grew up in this, is it true? Is it right? Was it actually abusive? Was it harmful? Was it right? And everything's shaking, and it's a terrifying moment. And that's what's going on here in this moment here. They had expected the Messiah to be different than Jesus. They had expected the anointed one that the Bible had prophesied about to be this like general who was going to lead them into battle and overthrow the Romans, and they would have their kingdom back. And it was all about this very tangible, very earthly, very vengeful, very broken way of seeing things. And they missed out on what was going on right in front of them. These are real people like you and I who had the opportunity to follow Jesus literally. And they missed out because they couldn't handle the shock to their worldview. They couldn't handle the shock to the foundation of how they saw the world. How often do you and I miss out on what Jesus wants to give us because it's too hard? So after the crowds have left, like we talked about last week, after the crowds have left, everybody's left. The scriptures say everybody left. We know that's not entirely true because like later there's still somewhat of a crowd. But the huge, massive multitudes, the 10,000 people who were there when Jesus was feeding them, they're gone. The crowds have left. Thankfully at Vox, we don't know what that feels like, right? The crowds have left, and Jesus is no longer the hot event in town, and he turns to the disciples, and there's this feeling in his gut. He turns and he says, you also want to leave? What about you 12? Do you also want to leave? How many of the disciples do you think tried not to make eye contact? You know, you've been there in a meeting or something like that, right? And the boss calls everybody out, and you're like, because you're there still, and you're like, no, Jesus, no, definitely we want to stay. But some of them are thinking, I'm not eating his flesh. That's not happening, right? Some of them, their worldview, they're like, I don't know. I guess I'll stick around. I want to see where this goes, but what if I made a mistake? What if I made a mistake following him? Because that's what he's asking. Do you think you made a mistake? This is what's being asked of followers of Jesus right now in our world today when we turn on the news. Do you also want to leave? For the last 2 years, we've been asked that question. Do you also want to leave? Now, let me be really clear. I'm not talking about church on Sunday morning. I'm not trying to be weird and manipulative to make sure that you keep coming, right? And that you at home feel guilty and show up. That's not what I'm trying to do at all, although it'd be lovely to see you here. That's not what I'm trying to do. That's not what I mean. I mean deeper. I mean at a foundational worldview level. Do you also want to leave? Because the church is leaving. Jesus died on the cross to make a way so that we can all come into a relationship with God. And the church has decided to be gatekeepers and shut the door. They left. During this pandemic, we have seen insane levels of fear, paranoia, and selfishness out of churches. They left and had the audacity to say that it was because of Jesus. Well, that's bullshit. They left. Jesus looked at them and said, what about you? Do you also want to leave? And they said, this teaching of self-sacrifice, this teaching of putting others first, this teaching of not worrying about my rights but about you, it's too hard. I got to go. I can't do it anymore. We're going to keep your name on the building because it works good for fundraising. But the teaching is too hard. How are you going to order your life? How do you decide what matters, what doesn't matter? How do you decide how you make decisions? How do you decide how you shop for groceries? How you spend your money in a world that is currently getting tighter and tighter and tighter? How do you decide what organizations to support or not support? How do you decide when to speak up and when not to speak up? How do you decide when to watch the news because you need to be informed? And how do you decide when to turn it off because it is destroying your mental health? Right? How do we make these kinds of decisions? How are we going to choose to live? joy-filled lives. Because the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. And it was that to an oppressed people who were persecuted and fed to lions. And in that place, there was still room for love and joy and peace. Are you going to choose to see the world through a worldview that isn't Jesus? And in light of what's going on in the world, are you going to let it shake your faith? Are you going to give in? Are you going to give up on the hard teaching and let selfishness creep into your own life? Are you going to give into the worry? Are you going to give into the fear? Are you going to give into the doubt? It is okay to have the worry and the fear and the doubt. But don't give into it. Yes, sweetie, what's your question? You are 100% right. For those of you who can't hear, she said she knows how to survive. It is family. Because community is one of those realities that Jesus has taught us. Peter steps up here, by the way. It's okay. He steps up and he answers for the rest of the 12, and hopefully he answers for us. John 6:68 says, Simon Peter answered, Lord, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are God's Holy One. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Lord, where would we go? I love it because there's doubt there. You can feel it, right? It's not, don't worry, Jesus, we're behind you no matter what. Right? That's what it should be, right? But that's not how he answers. He answers like, where would we go? Werner says it could be translated, Lord, the alternatives are not good. I love it because that's really what it is. Peter's like, we looked around because there were alternatives. Barabbas, who gets released with Jesus, you remember when we're coming up to Easter, and Barabbas was an alternative. He was a Messiah. He was someone they thought might be the Messiah. And he didn't work. He led a revolt and then ended up in jail waiting to be crucified. But he was an alternative. So they had alternatives. They looked at the alternatives and they're like, and Peter's like, they're not good. So we're going to stick with you for the time being. You know why I love that? Because that's about my level of faith. Because right now I turn on the news, it's about my level of faith. Lord, the alternatives are not good. Not convinced that you're really worth bringing your A game at the moment. There's Russian idiots shooting bombs at nuclear power plants. If we could not have that happen, right? But the alternatives are not good. We looked around, nobody else made sense. That's why you're still here. That's why all of us who've gone through this deconstruction period of Christianity, wrestling with our faith, it's why we're still here, because the alternatives, they weren't good. Lord, where would we go? You have the words of life. And so we look around, we test it, and we're all still here. We see the alternatives, the foundations that others have built their lives on, and they seem flimsy. They seem off kilter. They seem wrong. They don't have enough. It's like Peter saying, we don't find in the words of anyone else what we find in you. He's the one who has the words of life. Carrie and I watched this movie this week called Against the Ice. It was a new one on Netflix. It was one of these movies. It's about these two Danish explorers in Greenland in like 1909 or something who are trying to prove that Greenland is one solid island because the Americans were trying to claim some of it. And so they go on this huge expedition and they end up getting marooned actually on a small island off of Greenland for 3 years in Greenland, which, if you aren't aware, is not very green. It's very white. And it was cold. It's one of these movies, we watched it in bed, and the covers are coming up higher and higher and higher, and they're freezing, and they're starving because there's almost no wildlife, there's nothing. Watching their struggle to survive, I was reminded of the simplicity of life. human can survive 3 days without water. And depending on how much stores they have, 1 to 2 months without food. Without that, we're dead. Done. System breaks down. Lights out. 3 days without water. Lights out. There's something so desperate. And so watching this show and watching them try to figure out, like, they had some food that had been left by the ship that had broken up, and they're constantly counting their rations. And how much food do we have left? How much food do we have left? We need to go to half rations. How much food do we have left? There's something simple but desperate about our need to be connected to the life-giving reality of food and water. Lord, where would we go? You have the words of life. A couple of friends of ours just had little babies. I was thinking about the powerful imagery of a mother breastfeeding. This child comes out and needs so desperately to have that life-giving food, that life-giving connection, that life-giving nourishment. So desperate for mom. The name of God, El Shaddai, which is often translated as God Almighty, can actually be translated literally as the many-breasted one. There's something quite beautiful about, one, the feminine imagery about the Almighty God. Since most women that I know are some of the strongest creatures on the planet. And also the reality that is the nature of God, that life-giving nature of God. Lord, where would we go? You have the words of life. And often I think about when we go backpacking. One of the things I love about backpacking is life gets very, very simple really quickly. You have shelter, food, and you are always paying attention to where water is available. I've never hiked in a desert, and I've watched some and read some articles about people who've hiked the Pacific Coast Trail or parts of the Continental Divide down in New Mexico, and it is absolutely crucial that you are paying attention to water consumption. Because without it, you can get stuck, trapped. 3 days, that's all you got. Something so powerful about that imagery. Lord, where would we go? You have the words of life. We can't survive without you. We can't survive without that connection to life. Do you get the feeling of what Peter is saying here, the desperation? And when life is hard, like it is right now, this is when it matters most. That connection to what Jesus has taught us and showed us. This is when we have to know. Are we going to keep living the way he taught us that life was created to be lived? Are we going to stick to that? Roy and I were talking about that this week, right? There are these moments when we are angry, or frustrated, or scared. Are we going to trust? Are we going to stick with Jesus? Are we going to stick with his words of life? Or are we going to give in? Are we going to give in to these other kind of impulses and emotions, you know? Lord, where would we go? You have the words of life. And so it's in these moments we go back to the words of Jesus. We remind ourselves again what these words of life are. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and who thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in spirit, pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Peter understood that these words and so many more words of Jesus are life-giving in the middle of these sorts of situations that we find ourselves in these days. And we go back to them again and again, and we hear those words of life to remind ourselves that the crap that's coming from the world around us is not going to bring life. Getting in your truck and putting flags on it and driving down the highway to annoy everybody is not going to bring life. Fighting with people on the internet is not going to bring life. Making up fake persecution to make yourself feel better as a church in Canada is not going to bring life. And for us, getting high and mighty and believing that we have anything figured out is not going to bring life. But getting back in behind Jesus, they came out from behind him. And so we go back in behind him. And we're like, you know what? I was out there on my own for a little bit. I was trying, and I had my ideas, but it's safer. It is safer back here. How about you lead? How about you lead? How about I follow? Where else are we going to go, Lord? You have the words of life. Because he's the one that we can trust in the middle of all of this. And I want to say something that's kind of hard to hear. This past week, somebody said to me, they were talking, and they said, I was talking to a friend of mine, and they're really, really worried about everything that's going on, and they're like, man, we're all going to die. World War III is going to come, and we're all going to die. And he said, and I was trying to tell them, it's okay, we're not all going to die. And I said, well, actually, that's probably not the best thing to tell them. If I understand Jesus better, you should tell them, yeah, we may very well die, but that's okay, because that's not the end of our story. Because if I can trust Jesus to have the words of life, he always has the words of life. No matter how hard it gets, no matter if World War III breaks out, no matter if gas goes up to $5 a liter, no matter if groceries get sky high, no matter if all of the doom and gloom that everybody is saying might happen happens, where else are we going to go? He still has the words of life. And I want to leave us with Hebrews chapter 10. I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way, basically what we're talking about. He says, let's hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, because the one who made the promise is reliable. And let us consider each other, our family, carefully for the purpose of sparking love and good deeds. Don't stop meeting together with other believers, which some have gotten into the habit of doing. Instead, encourage each other, especially as you see the day drawing near. This is what we do, right? We come together as a family to remind each other, hey, it's not as bad as it looks. Okay, I lied. It's as bad as it looks. But the one that we're following has the words of life. He can be trusted. He's got us. The one who is for us is greater than the one who is against us.